Like I said earlier on, I've only known Alan for only a couple of months. We've met 2 months ago because I wanted to invite him for the conference. But I've been familiar with his writing, these essays that basically constitute the core of his recently published book called Archives of the Insensible. And I have a friend of mine who studies media theory at NYU, who's also a big fan of Alan. His name is Jason, and Jason told me about the book coming out and insisted that I should contact Alan and work with him. And I'm so glad that I did. So I'm going to, Alan Feldman, professor of media, culture, and communication at NYU, is the author of 3 books, including Archives of the Insensible, War, Photopolitics, and Dead Memory, 2015, and Formation of Violence, The Narrative of the Body, and Political Terror in Northern Ireland from 1991. You can imagine, this recent book has taken Alan a long time to develop, and it's really something. I totally recommend that you buy it and read it. He has published numerous articles on political violence, the political philosophy of the body and the senses, and on transitional justice. He teaches the politics of the gaze and philosophy of media at New York University.
I'd like to extend my thanks to the Rietveld Academy, to Jorlinda and Jort for the incredible hospitality, and ditto on the shout out to all those who have been maintaining and arranging the infrastructure for this very complicated event, and also to my thanks to Mohammad for inviting me. When he gave me the invitation, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that since I have not presented a talk in Europe for at least 2 years, that my topic would, given the recent events with the Syrian refugees in Greece, which is one of my adopted countries, and if you know Greece, the idea of the Mediterranean littered with floating bodies is a horror that's too difficult to contemplate. And those of us who are into ecology, Anthropocenes, and aesthetics, just on that basis alone, should act to deal and to alleviate and to end this horrific proto-genocidal situation. Because of the hysterics running for president who are manipulating the psychic apparatuses of the United States in a very effective manner, that my topic had to be xenophobia. But from the vantage point of a media archaeology. Now, listening to the conference, and since media archaeology is devoted to the history of the present, this is Foucault's formulation, it's an inquiry into the history of our present, which would also include the future as that which is present, P-R-E-S-C-N-T. So that we always have to think of the concept of the present or the contemporary as always present. And the kind of grammatical structure that has been underlying many of the discussions in the conference reminds me of what can be called the future anterior. And this is a cultural predilection, a cultural pattern in how we think, speak, and do futurity. The future anterior, to translate it into non-linguistic terminology, is to speak of the future that will have been. And that's what we have been doing for several days now. The future that will have been, in other words, we have been turning the future into the past. And we have to think about the complex temporal conjunctures and disjunctures, mediation and dismediation that allows our turning the future into the past, into that which has been, because we are writing our future in that way, in a fatalistic and deterministic manner. In the same way, the concept of the posthuman has also several aporias embedded in its language. At one level, the posthuman speaks to the issue of succession. There was a very interesting book that came out many years ago, Who Comes After the Subject? And certainly one of the issues that we can look at is who or what comes after the human. The whole concept of the post, What does the post mean? Is the post really post? Is this a sharp demarcation between that which was not post and that which has become post? And the post always comes after something, and the post-human comes after the human. But that word "after" is also extremely problematic. It could mean succession, but it also can mean coming after the human in the sense of pursuit, of a chase, of a hunting down, of a perpetual search for the human, coming in the footsteps of the human and following the human around. So that in many ways, the post-human will never disentangle itself from a definition of humanity. And in promoting certain formulaic and institutionalized definitions, it will repeat the same violence that Enlightenment humanism has been known to repeat, which is a constant bifurcation of the ontology of the human into the human and the unhuman or the non-human, the human into the animal, the human into the beast, the human into the unhuman or the anti-human. So this is a problem. In many ways, the discussion of post-humanity replicates one of the primordial gestures of humanism, which I would describe as the production of the self through the hallucinogenic creation of an anti-self. We have to think about that. What anti-selves are we producing and generating in the production and fabrication of the post-human, in our coming after the human, and following the human, following in the footsteps and the tracks left by the human. So, to also approach the issue of the theme of the conference that focused around bots and beasts, I want to also clarify some terms here. I've been collecting xenophobic machines. Now, define xenophobic. Xenophobic apparatuses. I like to use the Foucauldian term dispositif, power knowledge apparatuses, and this is one of the earliest ones. This is Hobbes's, Mohammad showed this image earlier, Hobbes's, the front piece of Hobbes's book, The Leviathan, drawn by Abraham Boss, heavily influenced by Archimbodian type of assemblage or collage type artwork, though with some exceptions. If you look at the torso of the body, what appears to be like fish scales, this is like a polysemic body here. On one level, they look like fish scales. On another level, they are the armor that protects the body of the sovereign. These fish scales / armor is actually composed of a multitude of bodies, all of which are not facing outwards towards the viewer, but facing towards the sovereign, so that you do not see their faces, you do not see their gazes, and their gaze seems to be returned by the binocular stare of the sovereign who stares outward from the tableau. The other interesting dynamic for me is that I think this is a proto-cinematic representation of the political, in the sense that the kind of Archimbodian collage of this multitude only stops at the face. And suddenly we have a kind of anthropomorphized face staring back at us. And so there's a discontinuity, there's a rupture between the multitude, the subjects of the sovereign, who constitute a particular political order. They're the constitutive subjects of the sovereign, without whom he would not be, or it would not be sovereign. And then we have this anthropomorphized face that is not constructed from an Archimbodian type of collage or montage. And this kind of indicates a severance between the head and the torso, which in many ways points to the fact that the sovereign, despite its constitution by the multitude, enjoys a certain autonomy over that multitude. Now, this is a xenophobic apparatus. It is also a beast. It's Leviathan. It's also a bot, because in Leviathan, Hobbes describes the sovereign as an artificial man and as an automaton, and as a mechanical apparatus. This is not a human. This is a prosthetic anthropomorphization of a machinic apparatus. And the role of the sovereign of the Leviathan was basically to protect its subject citizens from the state of nature, which was a state of perpetual war where man acts as if wolf to man. And these citizens have contracted themselves into a social body, into a political body, a body politic, in order to create this artificial apparatus that will securitize their lives and will protect them from outside dangers. In other words, the stranger and the alien that threatens them from the outside. And Foucault, in his writings, described this model of politics as pastoral power. Pastoral power is modeled on the notion of the shepherd who guards and maintains the health and safety and security of his flock, of his sheep. So the sovereign, this robot, this automaton, is basically a shepherd over his flock. But there's one caveat here. He has certainly the power and the right to protect the citizens from an external alien attack or enemy, but he also has the right to punish internally. And I think, and to punish sedition. And as part of maintaining the health of the body politic, he has the right to separate members of that body politic from the whole and exile them into the outside where they become the Schmittian enemy, the other, who can now be hunted down by the sovereign apparatus. So it's not just purely external enemies who are xenos, bios, xenokos, foreign forms of life, but internal citizens can be transformed, can lose their citizenship and be exiled into a state of bios, xenokos, a foreign form of life. And that's my theme, because I want to look at the xenophobia attached to racialization within American history, starting with the Middle Passage up to the current treatment of Muslims in the United States, but particularly those Muslims who are prisoners in the Guantanamo detention center. So when reviewing the literature on xenophobia, it's predominantly a moralizing and psychological reading that prevails and that associates xenophobic practices and discourses with irrational fears and cultural regression antithetical to modernity and to liberal society. However, what complicates this is the work of Emile Benveniste, who traces the term xenos, which means the stranger, the alien, and the guest all at once, to relations of reciprocal exchange and obligation between contracting agents, the guest stranger on the one hand and the host on the other. However, the Latin word host also etymologically connects to the concept of hostility and to the undesirable guest as enemy, hot, that is harbored as a contradiction in the body politic. Phobos, in classical Greek, was defined as flight in front of danger and associated with both fear and aversion, linked to the affects of contamination that are currently being carried by communicable, out-of-place, strange, and estranging bodies, both human and non-human, visible and invisible, which not only would include the terrorist or the economic migrant or the asylum seeker, but also the person carrying people with compromised immune systems and sexual and racial and gender alterities. So the force of technology in the formation of xenophobia has been neglected or rendered secondary in being reduced to a tactical tool for phobogenic imaginaries and policies such as the erection of walls and refugee or detention camps. This neglect of phobogenesis as a mediology, as media, ignores the symbiosis of optical apparatuses and scopic regimes that came into existence somewhere around the mid-19th century that focused on three dimensions of visualization that were enabled by the invention of cheap photographic cameras. And this was extensively documented by John Tagg in his book, The Burden of Representation. And he speaks about how by the mid-19th century, by 1850 in England alone, there exist archives of amounting to over 50,000 photographs that have been generated by prisons, mental institutions, asylums, and poorhouses where the urban other is being photographed, being archived and recorded in a variety of dossiers that are multimedia, that mix photography, writing, biometric data, demographic data, and eventually, down the line, fingerprints. So the three parameters that he looks at, or the three metrics, are one, typification. And this is very important. The photograph is used to produce types. The interest in the photograph is not typification is considered as the fabrication of the alien, the non-human, the unhuman, the bioxeneticos, which involves the production of the self through the hallucinogenic creation of the anti-self. And this is a form of typification. Now, this type of photograph, criminal penal photograph, was not a portrait of an individual of a singularity, but a specimen, an example, an exemplar of a type, a physiognomic type that revealed certain criminal and behavioristic tendencies. So these photographs were not read as isolate, atomized individuals, but they were read across the surface of the page, right? They were scanned across. So there was a serialization of the criminal body and cranial type. So we have typification, which is the production of specimens that are threatening and deviant others, part of the emergence of the urban crowd that promotes such fear and anxiety in industrial capitalism, where you have this proletarianized population who are working in the factories and other commercial ventures, yet they are consumers, they have money to spend. Many of them are recent migrants from the rural areas into the urban centers, and no one among the elites really know who they are. And so they have to be documented, classified, and I would argue containerized, at least symbiotically and symbolically at the level of virtual incarceration by the photograph. The other dimension here is if you look at the focus on frontality, how frontality, or facial, what we now call facial recognition, becomes the primary visual determinant of identity. There's nothing that requires that type of predilection or appropriation of the body from the point of view of its frontal and or profile. Here, profile is also another version of frontality. So you have typification, you have frontality. Now, frontality is quite interesting because I would argue that the frontalization of the face and of the body torso is literally a surgical bifurcation of the body into two, in which the back part of the body does not signify. It's simply extraneous matter that can be deposed. And if you know your Foucault and have read Discipline and Punish, you know to what degree the whole apparatus of panopticism was based on a frontalized presentation of the prisoner in a kind of theatrical proscenium type backlit cell. So frontality becomes the place where identity is constructed through a surgical separation of the front from the back of the body. And it's also part of the flattening out of the true human dimensionality of the body as part of its typification. And then, of course, as I said here, you have what I call panoramization going on in terms of forms of surveillance of the body. And these photographs were used to recognize incoming inmates in terms of their criminal proclivities or their mental health or lack thereof or their immigrant status by these institutions. the other dimension we have to contemplate is that the pose, the politics of the pose, the petrifaction and rigidification of the body is where disciplinary incarceration begins, prior to the throwing of the body into a cell or into some type of disciplinary regimen. It's in the act of taking the photograph, in the performativity of photographic expropriation of the body, where the camera becomes a disciplinary apparatus that produces certain types of bodily presentations through petrifaction, rigidification, through a freezing of the body in terms of space and time that begins the process of disciplinary inculcation, disciplinary objectification of these bodies. And I would argue that this kind of normative optical technology, descopic regimes that begin to develop in the mid-19th century are inherently xenophobic apparatuses, and that if you read Tagg, and Tagg in his work basically denies any notion of a unified field of photography. There's no single operational definition of photography or the photograph. He describes photography as a flickering across diverse institutional surfaces. So depending on where the practice and performativity of picture taking occurs, the photograph and the act of photography takes on different normativities and balance. So in this model, there cannot be any such thing as a value-free or neutral technology, nor can there be a technology that functions purely as a means to a particular end, as a kind of substrate or support, a kind of passive, inert surface that receives the imprint of a human agent in exercising and executing his or her intentionality. When the photographer takes these images, he or she is also part of the scopic apparatus. He is not an autonomous agent with a certain type of rights that are denied the prisoner, because he is also part of the incarcerated regime, and he's also constructing his or her gaze through the way the prisoner is being photographed. And of course, as you see, this is a multimedia presentation. And once I read Tagg's book many, many years ago and began looking at this archaeology of how photography becomes evidentiary juridically or medically, and we've seen a lot of evidentiary uses of the photograph today. I had to stop writing case histories. As a social scientist, I'm a trained anthropologist, because I recognize that the origin of the social science case history is here, in this type of oppressive apparatus. Now, even prior, and here's another example. This is from the famous photographic archive of Charcot, who basically was one of the first to psychiatricize inmates through medicalizing photography. Again, frontality, typification, and panoramization of mental illness, right? Of the psychic state now being externalized onto the surface of the body is one of the photographic projects of the Charcot presentation. And then you have ethnographic photography that begins to occur in the middle, late 19th century. And it's no coincidence that you've seen the same frontal and profile poses as you see here, right? The colonial project, which is an explicitly xenophobic project, has to document the colonial subaltern as if he or she is always already criminalized subject. So I'm arguing for a media archaeology of xenophobia that cross-cuts spatialized practices of excommunication and enclosure, such as the underhistory that historically enchains Guantanamo, the current anti-terrorist detention center, and immigrant detention centers that we have many in the United States, and you have them proliferating in Europe, from Greece up to the Austrian border, and detention centers to the Middle Passage, and its legacy of black mobilities and immobilities, that is to say, to a 600-year sequence of extraordinary renditions of people of color as alien chattel and movable property to black sites. And I would argue that extraordinary renditions that took place under the aegis of the War on Terror and the Middle Passage share the same political, legal, and xenophobic object, where a state or a commercial apparatus or some combination of the two exercises dominion over bodies, moving them at will and turning them into transposable capital, whether you were speaking of fiscalized capital or political capital, or some combination of both, because obviously if you're capturing and incarcerating terrorists, that improves your chances of funding the war on terror and funding these black sites, whether they are hidden prisons in Eastern Europe, or Abu Ghraib, or Guantanamo, or the plantation economy of the South from the 17th to mid-19th century. So I would argue, and this is based on dialogues with a colleague of Matteo's and my own, John Bella, who's been writing about this, that the Middle Passage constitutes a form of computational colonialism. And this computational colonialism was an experiment in the containerization of transposable and fiscalized alien bodies that persist today in the confining transportation of phobogenic terrorist and paperless transient bodies as political capital and forensic phantasms. Now we have to understand the phobogenic apparatus is not only about exclusion, it is a power knowledge apparatus. It's about the production of maneuverable images and maneuverable bodies through technological mediation. It is using the xenos, the stranger, the alien, the guest, as media to produce certain types of political power, political hegemony, and I only have to direct your attention to Donald Trump as the most recent example of his whole campaign apparatus is a xenophobic theater, which is producing particular forms of power and particular crowds in relationship to that power based on the exclusion, both symbolic but also real, of the alien other. And there's some very interesting work that's been done on the exclusion of people of color from his campaigns. So this genealogical trajectory could connect the computational colonialism of the Middle Passage and slavocratic power in the Americas to the computational containerization of the alien in the extermination camp, in Khmer Rouge execution photo archives in Cambodia, and to the militarized architecture and hierarchical and exclusionary infrastructures of Israeli settler colonialism in the West Bank, and of course American drone targeting kill boxes in West Asia. But also these images are also forms of containerization and transposition of bodies for power knowledge apparatuses. Okay, and this is a portrait, a blueprint of what I call computational colonialism. This is a blueprint diagram of the slave ship Brooke that had the capacity to stow up to 280, I think 87 or 82 slaves, but in actuality carried up to 400 slaves in his voyages. And you see in profile black bodies stored in serial form, right? And reduced to type, to specimens. There's no individuality, there's no singularity. There's some gender differentiation, there's some age differentiation because women and youth were segregated from the adult men in the stowage infrastructure. And this is, this is slavocratic infrastructure. This computational colonialism becomes a design element in this infamous 18th century diagram that dates back to the 1788. And this schematic is a blueprint for alien containerization that in this instance was designed to maximize the carrying capacity and profitability of the slave ship. Approximately 488 prone black bodies of captured Africans are displayed as laid out bits of abstract digital code in accordance with the 0 and 1 of the body tier ratio. So you have the body space, and then you have the negative white space of the tier. And it's always that ratio that allows you to, and to compute that ratio allows you to increase the profitability of the slave ship, which would also include throwing some of these people overboard when you began to run short of food and water, maybe because of storm systems that were slowing down your passage from Europe or Africa to the United States. So this is a cellular spatial order of bodies, which was a multiplex apparatus of extraordinary rendition and labor discipline, because you have to think of what it means to be held rigid in these small confining spaces. The labor discipline that is associated with slavery begins here, just as much as the penal discipline that's associated with panoptical systems of incarceration begins with the taking of the photograph. And this is a technological apparatus, not simply a ship for transporting bodies from point A to point B, but for disciplining bodies by inculcating a slave mentality, promoting what Orlando Patterson wrote in his book, Slavery and Social Death, the natal alienation of the slaves from their homes, communities, and also producing the existential experience of enslavement as what he calls a form of social death or zombification, living death. So this is a cellular apparatus that had as its function the making of conformable and genericized alien human bodies. It was an apparatus for the production of typification, for producing the slave as specimen. It is an infrastructure for the manufacture of subjugated embodiment as an instrument and end of production in itself, as both use value and exchange value. Use value because you're making a profit off of these slaves and you're putting them to work in plantations, and exchange value because you are constructing racial fantasies in the acts of typification and panoramization. Of course, this is also a form of panorama, right? And one of the things that is interesting about the whole political culture and computational practices of slavery is how you have very precise mathematization of the slave economy, of the slave labor force on one hand, and the other side of the coin is this production of racial phantasms that are completely surrealistic and completely imaginary and not rooted in any kind of quantifiable reality. So the same accountant or slave master who's keeping precise fiscal accounts of his slaves, documenting their age, their state of health, their skill sets, who they're married to, how many children they have. It's also the same person who develops the most grotesque fantasies around the simianization and the dehumanization and the bestialization of the African body. The dehumanization does not really apply here because they never enjoyed a human status which was taken away from them. They always emerged as beasts of burden. So current, more contemporary examples of this containerization technology for dealing with the alien other, and if you know anything about the Cambodian genocide committed by the Khmer Rouge, someone like me would have been an object of genocidal execution simply because I wore glasses. That was a sign of being an internal alien, an exterminate, someone who was inside but foreign. If I had a degree, was I a medical doctor or a lawyer, that would also qualify me for extermination. And prior to executing their prisoners, the Khmer Rouge also created archives, you know, the cellularization, as if they had to compensate for the erasure and defacement of the body through execution and mass burial by keeping the body in surrogate prosthetic forms as a kind of virtual reality of and historicization of the xenophobic threat within the nation state that they were beginning to construct via the production of mass death. We have to understand violence here is not simply destructive, it is productive. It produces surplus. There's something that's called disaster accumulation that unfolds from genocide and from slavery. Here is another xenophobic apparatus. This is a drawing, chart, made by Adolf Eichmann during his trial in Jerusalem for genocide, for which he was eventually hung and executed for his complicity and responsibility for the deportation of Jews, gypsies, and gays from Germany and other occupied countries to extermination camps. And basically Eichmann's argument was that he was basically a node in this assemblage, in this network, and not a decision-making figure of power, though he often contradicted that testimony. And he drew these computational charts to try to locate where his subject position was in the entire apparatus of genocidal planning. And again, we think of genocide as this irrational, phobic, hysterical, psychic apparatus, but the rationalization, the planning that this chart indirectly documents. And there's an element of reality-based representation, but there's also a lot of hallucinogenic fantasy going on here because Eichmann is using this chart to prove his non-culpability, to demonstrate his innocence, that he was simply following orders. And I find that this is a kind of grammatology of genocide in which human subjects are coupled with office apparatuses, documents that they sign off on, and also you could extend this to the infrastructure of trains and railway links that transported concentration camp prisoners to the extermination camps. And there's one chilling moment in his trial, which is on film, and on the internet, where he talks about how they converted troop transport trains, again, another form of containerization, which could fit up to 500 German soldiers with their backpacks and their rifles and their helmets, right? And they would take these same trains and they would squeeze over 1,000 prisoners into, because the prisoners did not have any luggage because that had been confiscated. They had very few goods and they simply had their clothing. And of course, these were the infamous train wagons from which, when they opened them up at the scene of arrival, sometimes half or more than half of the inmates had suffocated to death and just bodies poured out. So the trains themselves were apparatuses of execution, containerized execution, containerized death. But when Eichmann describes it, it's simply computational logic, how to translate and transpose 500 armed German soldiers into 1,000 Jews and gypsies and gays. Here's a more recent example of containerization that does not simply act upon a pre-existing alien or stranger, but is producing the alien and stranger through its technological invasion of the body. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the infamous photographs of Abu Ghraib, where prisoners were stripped, their bodily orifices were exposed into public purview, and they were kind of posed in pornographic scenarios where somehow there was a kind of resurrection of the dead memory of American pornography that these soldiers had seen years ago or more recently in the dead flesh of the prisoners. And then pictures were taken of these sexualized scenarios and tableau. And here I would point out that, as in the penal photographs of the mid-19th century, the camera was not simply reportorial, but was an extension of the abuse and degradation of the Abu Ghraib prisoners, in which the camera lens literally penetrates into the inside of the prisoner's body, turning the hidden terrorist inside out, so you can expose the innocent Iraqi citizen as the terrorist that he truly is, the sleeper or mole-like creature that he really is, but that's hidden in the depths of his somatic surface. So the camera was a penetrative instrument, which is part and parcel of the sexualization that was going on, and an extension of the torture and degradation of the prisoners. And this is a variation on the same theme, which is the forced feeding of Guantanamo prisoners who are going on hunger strikes. And it's very interesting, there are a group of Guantanamo prisoners who covertly go on hunger strikes so they can avoid the torture of being forced fed, and you'll see it in a moment, or indirectly see it in a moment. And the prison authorities have labeled them stealth strikers, right? They're kind of like hidden drones of prison resistance. And here's a drawing by a Guantanamo prisoner of what it means to be locked into this chair, another form of containerization, and have this tube forced down without any anesthesia down your nostrils. And again, the penetration of the state apparatus into the interior depths of the body, turning the body inside out to reveal the truth. It's a form of veridiction, of truth-claiming about the alien other. So, I would like to now go a little bit more back into to the early 20th century. I'm kind of going back and forth in time to look at lynching photography. There's a very interesting archive that has been gathered together called Without Sanctuary, where various collectors were able to assemble postcards, not just photographs, but postcards that circulated in the U.S. Postal Service somewhere from about 1900 to the mid-1920s or even early 1930s of the lynchings of extrajudicial lynchings of black people by white mobs. So these were, which meant that they were photographers on site at these lynchings who were taking pictures of these events and rapidly developing their photographs and turning them into postcards, which would be sold in the stores of the town, or even sold on site at the lynchings, depending on how long they took. Now, these lynchings traversed the South, but also the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic. There were lynchings in New Jersey, Texas, and even California. And they were a repeated subject of photographic spectacularization. I think here we have to understand that the lynching photograph combines two dimensions. And I borrow a phrase from Jacques Derrida. He talks about inspectacularity, which combines two terms, the spectacle and inspection, inspectacularization. And I think all these photographs combine these two notions of inspection and the spectacle, always applied to the alien other. These lynching photographs basically rendered the black body generic through defacement, through mutilation, and through burning. So it's very interesting that in most of the photographs, you cannot, even if you knew the person, you would not be able to identify them by visually, by facial recognition, because the bodies would be mutilated and defaced. And you have to understand the role of mutilation and defacement here is a kind of de-singularization of the body. In other words, you have to take the individual and transform him and produce him into the racial other. The same thing happened in the concentration camps, where people were stripped of their personal belongings, were given numbers and tattooed, and turned into digital, integers of the camp apparatus and depersonalized abstract specimens. So you get turned into a Jew. You get turned into a gypsy in the induction and selection process of the camp. You don't arrive as a Jew, but you have to be rendered generic through forms of flattening out and depersonalization. So I argue that the lynching photograph postcard was a prosthetic extension of an already existing historically implanted gaze applied to the black body, rendered generic by its defacement and bestialization. And I forgot to mention that Leviathan is a beast, and again, I would argue that the beast is not the animal. For singularized white faces posed over the raced body. Intrinsic to this project of racial typification was the mass production and circulation of these images as a cottage industry of lynching tourism. Now, why do I say it's a prosthetic extension? This type of scopic apparatus does not originate with the dissemination of mass photography in the United States from the mid-19th century onward. There's a very interesting book by Simone Brown, and she deserves full credit for this. I think you saw the first day someone was showing the HP computer facial display that could not show a black person, only a white person, and she's written about this extensively. And Brown's core thesis is that if you want, and it was written, her book was written during the NSA scandals promoted by Edward Snowden's leakage, and she basically points out that if you really want to understand the history of surveillance in the United States and in the war on terror, you have to, domestic and foreign surveillance, you have to go back to slavery, because the African American population was the most systematically and oldest surveilled population in the United States, and still remains so, because you can extend that history of slaveocratic surveillance to the post-slave era in these lynching photographs, and even to the recent events in places like Ferguson, in the killing of Michael Brown, or the killing of Trayvon Martin, where the type of hyper-surveillance is applied to the black male body as a specimen, not as an individual. And the role of the hood in Trayvon Martin's killing is very important here, is basically an extension of this logic of containing and controlling and managing what can be called black mobility. How do you immobilize black mobility, particularly in a post-slave, open-ended civil society where supposedly African Americans have the right of movement, the right of congregation in civil space? Okay, this is a photograph that I want to talk about extensively. It's the picture that was taken at the lynching of Laura and L.D. Nelson in Okemah, Oklahoma, in May 25th, 1911. Okemah, Oklahoma is the birthplace of the well-known American folk singer Woody Guthrie, and his father, Woody Guthrie was still a child then, but his father is standing on the bridge with about 10 other men, adult men and women, and about 18 children. So the heterogeneity by age and gender of the population. And on the top of the bridge, and we have to begin looking at the structure of the bridge as well as the camera as a kind of mediatic assemblage, a xenophobic apparatus of power and knowledge. They combine together, they make an assemblage where what lies above the bridge and what lies below the bridge is very significant. Now, you notice they were accused of stealing, and stealing a cow. It was their mother and son, and they were lynched without any trial, without any evidence by this mob, and they took them to this bridge, which is a symbol at that time of techno-modernity, and hung them off the bridge. And obviously the cameraman is positioned, you don't see him, but on a boat in the river, in the Canadian River. And you can see the reflection of what is called The Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday under the bridge. I know this is a horrific photograph. And one could infer the fact that if you were standing beside the cameraman, you could see the refraction of the cameraman standing in the boat as he took this very elegiac photograph. Now, we have to be reminded here that the early history of photography it was marked by the fact that photographers in the early 19th century wanted to emulate and compete with and displace landscape painting. So that landscape portraiture was a very important part of photographic history. And we see this very elegiac and bucolic landscape being represented here by the camera work. And it produces, and nature plays a major role here, as well as the directional trajectory of the above and the below. If the black victims have been animalized or bestialized, have been confined and containerized into a state of nature. It's obviously a nature that is decaying, is falling, is going from high to low. They're actually being projected somewhere below the condition of the natural world into a state of decaying nature, which was proper to the notion of creaturely life. And here we have to understand the figure of the creature, the creator, in Western European thinking that translates into the United States, migrates to the United States. The creature in Shakespearean England was an entity that emerges from the mud, right? Comes up from the mud. It's murky, it's slime, it's formless, it has a malleable identity. Its identity cannot easily be stabilized. You can think of the Shakespearean play, The Tempest, and the figure of Caliban. He's an exemplar of the creature. And the creature is a form of emergent life that has to be denied and repressed. And here there's an etymological connection between the notion of emergent life and the concept of emergency. So the emergence of alien life always precipitates a state of emergency. So the two victims are lowered below the bridge, and their corpses have already been mutilated. I'm not going to show you what was done to them or describe it. And they've been defaced, they've been burnt. And the white crowd is standing above them. And the usual interpretation of these type of horrific images is to focus on the victimization and the horrific things that were done to blacks and their bodies under these forms of extrajudicial killing. But I became much more interested in the body postures of the white crowd. And there's numerous photographs. I can show you another one very quickly, where you see the white crowd always in the foreground around the background and the background of the lynched African-American body. So you have a kind of figure-ground gestalt relationship. And I became interested in this foregrounding of the individual white faces, the crowd, in relationship to the anonymized, defaced black body. And I would argue that what we're seeing here is the production of whiteness through its passage through the defaced medium of the black body, or what I described earlier as the production of the self, in this case, white selfhood, through the hallucinogenic creation of the anti-self. So, to get back to this photograph. So what do we have here? I think what we have here, thank you, is what Ernesto Laclau called populist reason. What we have here is a democratic gathering. This is democracy in action. It's racialized democracy, but these are sovereign citizens who are dealing with a beast, with a non-human, in such a way that any possibility of anthropological commonality is rendered null and void. So we don't have whites and blacks here. And we don't even have humans and animals here, because these white crowd are no longer human. They are sovereign forms of power. They are the democratic crowd. This is an exercise in majoritarian democracy, which is why you have to have the children there. So they're a good representation, a good sampling of the American crowd. And they are producing their whiteness through the defacement, through the mediation of the black body. And what's interesting about this photograph is this kind of closed circuitry which naturalizes. I mean, nature is being racialized, and race is being, and nature is also being politicized at the same time. So you have this closed circularity. This is a hermetically sealed world of where whiteness produces itself off of particular forms of containerizing and displacing black bodies. And I call this a politics of vomit. Another level of this photography is biopolitical portraiture. The white vigilantes are frequently foregrounded against the defaced victim. In these acts of populist reason and customary law, the constructed sameness of white raciality coincides with the typifying sameness of democratic fraternity, which is very paternalistic and androcentric. It's never sorority, it's always fraternity, male, gendered, from which blacks are barred, and yet which they mediate through the scarification and civic dereliction of their bodies. Both race and democracy find their condition of possibility in the inadmissible black body, provisionally subordinated, assimilated, or ingested, only to be periodically regurgitated in an exercise of bulimic politics. I could go on in this, but I would like to not end on such a negative note. I know Mohammad had that expectation of me. He wanted me to shock you. But I also want to talk about and describe another form of the production of the alien, of the biocenicos. People like Paulo Vernal has written very eloquently about the multitude as a form of biocenicos, as a form of political resistance and alterity. So let me read to you, as a part of a conclusion, a narrative that emerged from the Greek demonstrations in Syntagma Square in Athens, where since July 2008, the Greek masses have been off and on demonstrating against the infliction of a near genocidal odious debt by you folks, the EU, on their everyday life. You know, odious debt is defined as the imposition of a debt that does not allow a society to sustain its basic structures and services because of the fiscalization of everyday life and the taxation that occurs from that. And odious debt is seen as a human rights violation and a form of what I would call sociocide that prevents sociocide, S-O-C-I-O-C-I-D-E, that odious debt interdicts the capacity of a society to reproduce itself in time and space. So here's a description of the demonstrations in Syntagma Square, which is in front of the Greek parliament, which was originally built in honor of an imposed German king. And now we have an imposed German queen, Angela Merkel, who rules Greece. Since yesterday, July 28th, 2011, we live like cockroaches in Syntagma Square. We are sprayed continuously with chemicals by the Greek police, regardless of what we do or what we say. But we persist. We leave Syntagma Square for a while to catch our breath and keep on coming back. We rest a bit and return to the square. As we are becoming cockroaches, and this is obvious allusion to Deleuze's becoming animal, as we are becoming cockroaches, we begin, without really realizing it, to adopt tactics of stasis, of perseverance and endurance that were previously unknown to us. Chemicals keep on flying. Sound bombs keep on exploding all around us, making terrible noise. And the crowds respond by not leaving, by remaining at Syntagma Square. Becoming cockroaches and growing more and more resistant to the chemicals, our bodies begin to mutate. In gas masks, painting Malox on our faces, because that helps with the tear gas, on our faces, wearing sunglasses and ski masks, we persist. The figures in gas masks and Malox recognize each other even when they meet further away from Syntagma Square. It's the end of the quote. Becoming cockroach. So let's think a little bit about the Greek cockroach and how that form of political agency came into existence. One day, not so long ago, this is my commentary, the Greeks, as if in a story by Kafka, awoke to find themselves transformed due to odious debt into fiscal vermin. So you can think of Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis. In Kafka, in many of Kafka's stories, one awakes to a home or a body that has been unhomed, that has lost home, that has been mislaid and rendered uncanny, mutable, and strange or alien into a bios xenokos, a foreign form of life. The everyday becomes suspended, or worse, dislocated at the edge of awakening. And the everyday in this awakening is no longer a fully constituted reality. It is not closed. It is open to other possibilities and alterities. So think of this notion of awakening, where in Kafka you awake to a home and a body that's been dislayed and rendered strange. In Kafka, there is a metamorphosis in every awakening that changes the relation of subject and world. And the Athenian cockroach is a political agent that refuses containerization through tear gas, smoke bombs, and sound bombs, and police fencing off. So there is a metamorphosis in every awakening that changes the relation of the subject to the world. The Athenian cockroach emerges between the world that has been and the world to come, and perseveres at this edge, this fissure in accepted reality in the capital and in the state. However, the Athenian cockroach awakes to reject the dream of his or her fiscal culpability, his or her guilt. And here we have to think of Walter Benjamin's famous essay of Capitalism as a Religion, in which Benjamin describes capitalism as a cult of culpabilization for which there is no atonement. One is condemned not to punishment under capitalism, but to an ending guilt, to an ending indebtedness, where Benjamin plays on the German, where Schuld means both debt and guilt at the same time. So the Athenian cockroach emerges between the world that has been and the world to come, and perseveres at this edge, this fissure in accepted reality, in a fissure in the reality of both capital and the state. However, the cockroach awakes to reject the dream of his fiscal guilt and debt, but also to accept metamorphosis as an unplaceable body. To accept metamorphosis as an unplaceable body. Don't be quick to locate and place the posthuman. The political economy of the cockroach is not a finality or a teleology, but a simultaneous point of insertion and desertion. There's a moment of abandonment of the given structure of reality. So an insertion into something else. Desertion and insertion. A moment ex nihilo, from nothing, into a space of heterogeneous, multiple self-constitution, conditioned by and yet severed from the state and its residual implantation of bodies and spaces under its given political and economic order. Becoming cockroach is not organically related to a prior political determination. It is a self-amputating prosthetic, an organ without body, an organ without organic organization. And I become very interested in the notion of the disorganic and its relationship to disorganization. We think of body politics as organs, as composed of organs and as an organ in itself. But an organ could be a means to an end, or it could be its own body. So very interested in the detachable organ that disconnects itself from a wider body politic. An organ without organic organization. That's how I describe the Athenian cockroach. Becoming cockroach opens up a politics of unbinding. The cockroach is a disorganic multiplicity made up of contingent compositions without underlying ground. This detachable organ of insurrection is no longer a citizen, no longer a worker, no longer a consumer, no longer an organ of the state and capital, but an organ of the latter's disorganization, its decomposition. The citizen become vermin or cockroach negates its own concept as an organ of an organization. The citizen is an organ of a wider organization, the state and civil society. But when the citizen turns into vermin, they become a contradiction and negation of their own concept as citizen. Deleuze describes, so the cockroach becomes a disorganic incorporeality. We haven't talked about incorporeal bodies, bodiless bodies, enough this week. Deleuze describes this becoming as the incorporeal language of events. He connects it to irreality, incorporeality, and uncertainty, and paradox, and the disorganic as the objective structure of the event and of a coming political speciation. So in many ways, the Abyssinian cockroach becomes worldless, without a world. And Matteo mentioned von Usko, and von Usko was a big influence on Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger, if you've read his work on the animal, basically has a tripartite structure within which he locates the animal. It's a kind of trajectory, a spectrum. He says there is the stone, which has no world, Weltlos. There is the animal that is poor in world. And then there's man who can fabricate worlds. So I'm interested in this kind of political metaphor of the animal that is poor in world, but also has the possibility of becoming worldless, becoming like the stone. But at the same time, becoming worldless can contain conditions of political possibility. It can be to depart from a closure and to create an aperture. Hannah Arendt understood this notion of becoming worldless. And she astutely argued that the democratic struggle of late modernity would not be the Enlightenment project for a specific set of descriptive and prescriptive natural rights, human rights, that previsioned and inframed a pre-sent humanity, right? The notion of rights as kind of pre-inscribed into a human anthropologized ontology. This is the Enlightenment model. We saw an example earlier on in terms of the UN kind of modern updating of these kind of pre-inscribed naturalized rights of the human. Such datable rights, these prescribed naturalized rights, promote a regulative image and a positive law of the human from which certain populations and life forms could be and have been frequently expelled and rendered non- or subhuman and inherently rightless and thus poor in world or worldless, as the debt-stricken masses of Greece. Endowed or removed rights give and take worlds and give and take worldlessness. Positive human rights preclude an inaccessible excess, the contingent and incalculable becoming of a subject of rights unconstrained by any foundational, anthropological, or world structure or trajectory. Thus, a rights-bearing subject could appear through the open-ended projecting, imaging, and imagining of what Hannah Arendt called a right to rights, which is not a definable set of rights. To claim and to construct a right to rights does not predetermine which rights you have a right to. It's left open-ended. So a right to rights is not one of a series or a set of rights, but a para-political proto-right that precludes any predetermined subject of right or the worlding of natural rights. The right to rights taken to its limits is not a positive power, but a constitutive proto-subject, post-subject, and abject, irrespective of what the claimant of this proto-right has been, unbecomes, or becomes. The right to rights, and this is this is xenomorphism, this is xenogenesis, this is the construction of a bioxenokos. The right to rights can be claimed by any existing natural, can be claimed beyond, so let me start that again. The right to rights can be claimed beyond any existing natural or political legitimation by an existence without predicates. A right to rights is claimed by an entity, by an existence without prior predications, without prior pre-comprehended collective identity. And we have to really begin to think about how much our social world and our political world and how much xenophobia operates under this notion of pre-comprehended collectivities, a kind of apperception of collective identity when you meet a singular individual and say, he's black, she's Muslim, he's a terrorist, he has AIDS. That's the activation of pre-comprehended collectivity in the singularized form of the encountered other. So, the right to rights can be claimed beyond any existing natural or political legitimation by an existence without predicates, without pre-comprehended collectivity, speciation, or culture, or a state, or a world. To be poor in such worlds may well prepare political apparity, a political opening. The right to rights is also a right not to claim rights as a refusal of a positive identity, self-limited by the appropriation of an essentializing right. In other words, the notion of rights in our current societies is one of negative rights. I, as a citizen in America, have sovereign rights that I can exercise as long as in exercising those rights, I don't neglect or interdict or prevent the exercise of sovereign right by another citizen. So it's a self-canceling negative right. Right to rights goes beyond that, because it's also a right to refuse rights, to not allow your identity to be containerized by the association of your identity with a specific set of prescriptive rights. And this refusal of right, as with the Athenian cockroach, is also an assertion of a right to opacity. And here I want to conclude with this insight from Edouard Glissant, who was a very important Deleuzian philosopher, also a poet in his own right from Guadeloupe, who really came out of the, in reaction to colonial scopic regimes, which are predicated on this kind of unending, unlimited penetration of the colonized body. And one of his right to rights was the right to opacity, particularly for the colonized and the formerly colonized. So I'll stop here.